Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar of a series of webinars that we plan to have to educate the public and about the Holocaust and its effects on history and the present and the future. My name is Dr. Michael Lozman. I'm president of the Capital District Jewish Holocaust Memorial, and I'm a proud member of a group that is devoting their energy and their time toward the construction and the development of the Holocaust Memorial. You know, the memorial exists for two central reasons. One is to memorialize the 6 million Jews that were killed only because they were Jews. And the second reason is to be a landmark to speak against hatred and bigotry and prejudice. And this is for all of us, and this is so especially important in today's world, and we're totally dedicated to its development. I'd like to take a moment and give you some background about our speakers. Our opening speaker is Murray Jaros. He is a local resident and a Holocaust survivor. His background is really quite extraordinary. He came from a small village in Poland near the Lithuanian border. And when the Nazis invaded, they herded him and his family and all the other Jews in the community into a ghetto. And he and his family were able to escape, luckily, because those that did not escape were killed. They fled into the forest, and his parents joined the partisans, a group that were fighting against the Nazis. And he, as a young boy, was given into the care of a farmer who had him dressed as a girl for his own protection during the course that they were engaging in their partisan activities. Eventually, they were fortunate enough to travel to West Germany, and then from there to the United States. Murray Jaros will be our introductory speaker. The second speaker, of course, is Professor Stephen Berk, who is a professor of history at Union College, Schenectady, New York. I'm sure most of you know him. He is a treasure to the community, a gifted speaker, and he will provide you with a remarkable historical understanding about Poland and the Jews during the time of the Holocaust. You are in for a treat. I've met many of his students, past students that have been there, his students maybe 20 years ago, and they all exclaim what a remarkable speaker he is. Then our closing speaker will be Rabbi Scott Shpeen from Beth, Emeth here in Albany, one of our several incredible rabbis. And he had an interesting experience that he had visited Auschwitz concentration camp in Auschwitz, Poland, and along with Steve Berk and Bishop Schaffenberger from the Albany Catholic Diocese. And as you may or may not know, it is Bishop Schaffenberger through the diocese that donated the property for the construction of the memorial. And of course, we're deeply indebted to him for that. What I do want you to know is that we have a Q&A button for you to push during Professor Berk's lecture. And at the end of the webinar, Professor Berk will then address the questions that you introduce. So sit back, you're in for quite an experience, and I'm so glad that you're listening with us.
My name is Murray Jaros. I'm a retired lawyer. I'm a Holocaust survivor. As my eyes cannot unsee and my ears cannot unhear all that I experienced, I support the Holocaust Memorial because I consider it to be a resource for education, remembrance, and learning of what hatred, blind, causeless hatred, racism, and anti-Semitism can result, as it had in the greatest genocide experienced in human history. I believe the Holocaust Memorial will be such a remembrance. We must teach, we must learn, we must remember. My experience with the Holocaust began in 1941, when the Nazis, through their SS division, invaded our community. They came to our town and invaded our homes at night, late at night, our home and the homes of other Jewish residents. They dragged us out of our rooms and brought us into the living room. My grandmother, my mother's mother, her father, her mother, I, and a cousin who was living with us at the time. They stripped my parents bare and beat them until they passed out, demanding gold and money. Time and again, they revived them and beat them again. They killed my grandmother. They tortured her father. And then they herded the entire Jewish community into a makeshift ghetto, squeezed in like sardines. We were able to survive and escaped. In the last attack, we were pushed deep into a swamp well over our knees, but we stayed for 6 weeks. Eventually, word came around that we were able to get out. In fact, we had to get out. We were emaciated, hungry, and barely were able to move. But we made our way back to our little community. They found nothing there. All the Jewish properties were destroyed, and a mass grave of people that were executed, the Jewish people in the ghetto. We went to Warsaw, Poland, Lodz, then Berlin, ending up in Bavaria, in the American sector, in ADP camp, displaced persons camp, or today we refer to them as refugee camp. I stayed in that camp for 3 years, my parents 4 years. In 1951, I was allowed to come to the United States and reunited with my parents, where I began my education, my college and law school careers, and after that, my professional career here in this area. I am very grateful for what I was allowed to do and achieve here in the United States. And now it is my great privilege to introduce Professor Stephen Berk, PhD, history professor and professor of an endowed chair at Union College, whose scholarly, masterful knowledge and eloquent and articulate lecturing on the subject is second to none. Is able to teach not only the college-age students, but all of us. And he will speak more about the subject. My privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to present Dr. Stephen Berk.
Good evening, my friends. Thank you, Murray, very, very much. Thank you, Dr. Lozman, for all of the work that you have done. On the first day of every class that I teach at Union, I tell the students, you cannot explain the present by the present. Everything has a history, and history informs the present and the future. So if the present for the purpose of this lecture is Polish-Jewish relations during the period of the Holocaust, then we've got to go back in history. I'll do it as succinctly, I think, as humanly possible. I mean that Jews had settled in Poland really almost 1,000 years ago. Poland was a good place for the Jews. In fact, in the early parts of the 14th century, the Polish king Kazimierz had invited Jews to settle in the country. And that sparked a large-scale Eastern migration of Jews. We are familiar with the Western migration. That is with Jews coming to the United States and ultimately some of them going to Palestine. But this was an Eastern migration. Kazimierz wanted the Jews to bolster the Polish economy. And the Jews, reeling under the impact of the Crusades, finding pogroms, finding attacks upon them, all sorts of discriminatory legislation, they moved to Poland in fairly large numbers. Within a relatively short period of time, the Polish Jewish community would be the largest Jewish community in Europe, and probably at one point in time, the largest Jewish community in the world. So it was a good period for the Jews. They were prominent rabbis, yeshivot, Jewish learning, Jewish scholarship. Again, I don't want to minimize the difficulties or romanticize this particular period. But in contrast to France, where there was a St. Bartholomew's night in the middle of the 16th century, when Catholics killed every Protestant that they could get their hands on. And in Spain, expulsion and pogroms, none of that happened in Poland. Not many people are going to die burned at the stake in Poland in this period of time. There were tensions, and this is an important point, because it will carry over into a much later period. Poland was a Catholic country, and the problem was that Catholicism and all Christian religions of that period of time had a great deal of antipathy for the Jews. It is a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, a man by the name of Jules Isaac, a physician who lost his entire family, who coined the expression, the basic teachings of contempt. These were teachings of virtually all Christian denominations, and particularly the Catholic Church, up until Vatican II in the 1960s. By that I mean teaching number one. Judaism at the time of the appearance of Jesus was spiritually bankrupt. The Jews worshipped, so said the church, the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. And the story in the New Testament that made that clear was, there's Jesus chasing the money changers out of the temple. Look at the Jews changing a buck, turning a buck, right near the Holy of Holies. In reality, there had to be money changers in the vicinity of the temple. Jews from all over the diaspora were coming. They were buying animals to sacrifice at the temple. They had to change their currency into the local currency. But the most important teaching is teaching the idea that the Jews were guilty of the greatest crime ever perpetrated on the planet. Homicide is murder, terrible crime. Parricide, the killing of a parent, is worse than that. Regicide, the killing of a king, is worse than that. But the Jews are guilty of the greatest of all crimes, deicide. That is, according to testimony, according to, let us say, statements in the New Testament and the Gospel of Matthew and John, the Jews are guilty of the crime of killing the Son of God. Now, this is not the course, this is not the lecture to talk about whether this is a true statement or not. Virtually all historians agree that the Roman government, in the face of represented by Pontius Pilate, no Roman governor, no Roman procurator is going to ask the local population, what do you do with this man? What should we do? Should we hang him? Should we crucify him? Should we not? The Romans didn't act like that. The Romans made the decision. And Vatican II is going to recognize that, eliminating any talk about the guilty of the Jews at that time and at all times for being responsible for the death of Jesus. But again, perception is reality. The idea of the Jew as Christ killer was alive and well for almost 2,000 years. And I'm sorry to say, in some quarters, it probably is still alive to the present day. Teaching number 3, God is so angry at the Jews because they have killed Jesus, one of their own, God's son. How could they do this? And that meant, according to the church, that the covenants between God and the Jewish people are abrogated. There is now a new chosen people, and that is the Christian church. So what all of this means is it leaves a legacy, an indelible legacy in Western civilization of dislike and even hatred for the Jews. That is carried in some ways and in some circles into Poland. So that's a problem for the Jews in Poland. But again, no pogroms, no expulsions, and it may seem remarkable to you, given what we're going to talk about somewhat later, that Poland is probably the best place in Europe for the Jews at this period of time and for a number of centuries. But then a catastrophe is going to strike Poland. That is, if you are familiar, and I'm sure you are familiar with the geography of Europe, Poland was cursed by a terrible geography. To the east were the Russians, to the west were the Prussians, and also the Austrians. Very greedily, those countries, the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians, are going to want to carve up Poland. And they eventually will carve up Poland. 3 times in the 18th century, 1772, 1793, and 1795. Poland will be attacked by those countries and will be partitioned. Poland will not exist as a country after 1795. From 1795 to 1918, there is no Poland. There's a Russian Poland. The major part of Poland went to Russia, including the city of Warsaw. There's an Austrian Poland. That is the area of Galicia, where many Jews come from. And then there was Prussian Poland. That is Silesia. So there's no Poland from 1795 until the end of 1918. In this period of time, the Poles dig in. This is a time when the Poles look to their religion to nurture them. They look to their religion, to Roman Catholicism, to give them great strength. And they will need all the strength and spiritual nourishment that they can get. It is not easy to be a Pole in this period from 1795 to 1918. And the Poles, interestingly enough, use a term from the Jewish tradition to describe this period, 1795 to 1918. They refer to this period as the time of their Babylonian captivity. And then, drawing deeply upon their religion, they make Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Queen of Poland, and say that Mary intervenes with God and somehow will convince God to alleviate the problems of Poland. And what do the Poles say about their nation, their country? Poland is referred to by the Poles as the Christ of the nations. Just as Jesus was crucified and resurrected, so the Poles argue Poland was crucified, but Poland will be resurrected. Unfortunately for the Jews, an equation is made that is going to cause them a great deal of problems, both in that period of time and later. And really, you could argue in some ways down to the present time. The equation is a Pole equals a Catholic. That is, you cannot be considered a Pole unless you're a member of the Roman Catholic Church. One can understand that other minorities will find themselves in a difficult position. Since the Jews were in a minority position, and they faced all sorts of difficulties from the church and from the rulers, the Jewish position is going to deteriorate to a certain extent. So here we are in this period, 1795 to 1918. There's industrialization of Poland. That is, the city of Lodz, or what in Polish is called Łódź, becomes an industrial center, is referred to as the Polish Manchester, the great textile center of the Russian Empire. And what's going to happen is there will emerge a Polish middle class. And as the night follows the day, there will be a great deal of competition between the Polish middle class and the Jewish middle class. So in addition to some religious tensions that existed, there is now class tension and economic competition. These are the breeding grounds for a growing anti-Semitism by the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Liberation comes for Poland in November of 1918. When the First World War comes to an end, The empires that had partitioned Poland and occupied Poland are no more. To use Trotsky's expression, they disappear into the garbage can of history. There's no more Romanov dynasty in Russia. There's no more Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany, and there's no more Habsburg dynasty in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All the occupying powers are really up against the wall. Poland is now free to determine its own future. We are now in the interwar period between 1919 and 1939. The best way to describe it, and I'm not the one that coined the expression, but I think on balance, it is a good expression. Poland was a bad place for the Jews, but a good place for Judaism. I will say that again. Poland was a bad place for the Jews, but a good place for Judaism. In this interwar period, we see pogroms against the Jews. 1,500 Jews died in pogroms in the 1920s and the 1930s. There was economic discrimination against the Jews, boycotts against the Jews. There was a numerus clausus, a quota system in Polish universities and Polish high schools. And in those schools where Jews were present, were students, where Jews were there was the so-called ghetto bench. That is, all the Jews had to sit in a single row. There were days at Polish universities that Jewish students had their heads bashed in. The small number of Jewish professors in Polish universities found themselves really under the attack of physical violence. In the medical schools of Poland, there was a quota on Jewish entrance. The Jews had to supply their own cadavers. They had to be Jewish cadavers. It was not fitting, it was said, for a Jew to operate on a Polish body. So it is a difficult time here. And I must say to you, the sources of this tension, the source of this hostility to the Jews, some of it is old news and some of it is new news. One is the economic competition. Comes the depression, remember Poland to begin with, is an impoverished country. The situation deteriorates significantly in the 1930s. So it's Polish store owner against Jewish store owner, Polish professional against Jewish professional, Polish stall owner against Jewish stall owners. Wherever you went in Poland, there was competition between Jews and Poles against the background of endemic poverty. In addition to that, the Catholic Church in the 1930s took a tough position on the Jews. In the 1930s, the Cardinal Juan, the chief Catholic primate of Poland, issued a pastoral letter that was written in every church, spoken about in every church in Poland. It warned the Polish people, watch out for the Jews, be careful of them. Have no business dealings with them because their ethics are bad. They're sexual perverts. They're pornographers. Stay away from them. Now, Cardinal Juan drew a very, very thin line. He said all of this, but he also said, don't resort to any acts of physical violence against the Jews. Again, it's a thin line. Some people crossed that line. Some Poles carried out attacks upon Jews. And then there was the new bogeyman. And this is an important point, not only for this lecture, but I would say to you, as I say to my students at Union, you cannot understand the 20th century unless you understand the appeal of communism and the fear of communism. As Americans, we understand this. After all, we're 4,500 miles from the Soviet border when there was a Soviet Union. And look what happened in our country. Red Scare after Red Scare, the Hollywood blacklist, the Sacco Vanzetti trial, the McCarthy period. Again, 4,500 miles away from the Soviet Union, Americans had Red Scare after Red Scare. We were frightened. The commies are coming. If you lived in a country that had a contiguous border with the Soviet Union, then the fear was even greater. And what I'm talking to you about is the belief. In some quarters, again, some places held it didn't down to the present day, even in our own country. The idea that Jews and communists go hand in hand. Now, the origin of this idea is that there were a number of Jews or people of Jewish extraction in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in leadership positions. Zinoviev was a Jew, Trotsky was a Jew, Radek was a Jew, Kamenev was a Jew. There's an old Soviet joke. Let's kick Lenin out and have a minion. But the fact of the matter was the overwhelming majority of Jews rejected communism and opposed communism. It's the chief rabbi of Moscow in the year 1912 who laid it out very well. The Trotskys play the tune, but the Bronsteins pay the piper. Bronstein was Trotsky's real name. Trotsky was a pseudonym. The overwhelming majority of Jews, again, I'm telling you, were anti-communist or certainly were non-communist. But a disproportionate number of the communists were Jews. That was true in Poland. There were 50,000 communists in Poland out of a total Polish population of 30 million. Of the 30 million Poles, there were over 3 million Jews. In all of Poland, there were 50,000 communists. 50,000 communists out of 30 million Poles. But 20,000 of those communists were Jews. The fear of communism, its godlessness, its attack upon private property, scared the living daylights out of large numbers of people. The identification of Jews with communism will plague the Jews right down to the present time. So in addition to economic competition, in addition to religious antipathy or hostility towards the Jews, there is the belief that the Jews are communists. Now, remember what I said to you, please, less than about 10 minutes ago. Poland was a bad place for the Jews, but a good place for Judaism. By that is meant there were no restrictions on Jewish religious life. A flourishing of Jewish culture, both religious culture and non-religious culture. There were hundreds of Jewish newspapers and magazines that were published in Poland in the interwar period, published in Yiddish, published in Hebrew, published in Polish. There were Jewish political parties. There were no restrictions on Jewish political life. There was a flourishing Yiddish film series. There were film productions. There were plays. There were magnificent Jewish writers. This is the high tide of Yiddish culture in the entire world. Poland was the center of Yiddishkeit in the entire world. But discrimination for sure. There was even an expression that was used to describe Jewish youngsters, teenagers, young men and women in their early 20s. They were called a youth without a future because of the poverty of Poland and because of the anti-Semitism within Poland. And then, again, catastrophe will strike Poland. September 1st, 1939, Hitler orders the German army into Poland, beginning the Second World War. The war begins in typical Nazi fashion. On the night of August 31st, just before the war began, just before the German invasion of Poland, the Nazis took out a number of people from a concentration camp. We don't know who these people are. Some of them were Jews, presumably. Some of them weren't. Most of them probably were not Jews. They were dressed in German army uniforms, and then they were shot. And they were dumped on the Polish-German border, and Hitler got on the Nazi radio and told the German people that these German soldiers, innocent German soldiers, who were simply standing guarding the border, were attacked by Polish bandits and by Polish soldiers. Of course, it was not true. That became the pretext for the German invasion of Poland. When the Germans come into Poland, they are going to carry out, let's say, a manifestation of mass terror. Not the mass terror that's going to come later on, but mass terror. Jews are put in synagogues and the synagogues are burned to the ground. Large numbers of Poles are going to be shot in this period of time. By the end of 1939 and early 1940, there is going to be a reduction of that type of violence. What takes its place is the ghettoization of the Jewish communities of Poland. Murray Jaros told you about his community that was placed in a ghetto. All over Poland, the Jews were placed in ghettos. The ghettos were, for want of a better expression, hermetically sealed. By that I mean, you can't get out of the ghetto. The only way out of the ghetto is to be carried out as a corpse. If you're caught leaving the ghetto, you're going to be shot. Jews will be forced to place a Jewish star on them. The ghettos will be very, very highly concentrated, a tremendous concentration of population. The largest of the ghettos was the Warsaw Ghetto. Before the war, 1 out of every 3 people living in Warsaw was Jewish. At the height, the Warsaw Ghetto had probably 485,000 people. The conditions in the ghetto are horrendous, absolutely horrendous. People starve. The average caloric ration for Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto is 160 calories per day. I'm not being condescending here. I'm simply saying to you, one doesn't have to be a wizard of nutrition to understand what's going to happen. Massive starvation. Sanitation is going to decline precipitously. Typhus stalks the ghetto. And the Nazis come in sometimes simply for sheer recreation or hunting for what they consider to be Jewish partisans. They will kill. They come in and they just shoot randomly. They'll pick out some people, shoot them, collect hostages, do all sorts of things. What this is going to mean is that the conditions are poor. The numbers of stillborn children, tremendous. Children die all the time. You see photographs of them, they're dying on the streets. 20% of every ghetto that the Nazis established, 20% of the Jews in every ghetto established by the Nazis, 20% of the Jews are dead before the deportations. 20% of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto are dead before they are deported to Treblinka. The conditions are absolutely abominable. So what is the Polish response to this? It is let's say it's a varied response. One cannot make any monolithic or general statements here. On the one hand, there were Poles who carried on with the old anti-Semitism. The Jews are evil, the Jews are not, they're Christ killers, the Jews are communists, the Jews are ferocious economic competitors, it's good to get rid of them. There were a number of Poles, how many we do not know, how many we do not know. So you can't make, say, 20%, 30% or 40%, we simply do not know. But there were a number of Poles that collaborated with the Germans in the murder of Jews. They murdered Jews themselves, they betrayed Jews, they raped Jewish women and Jewish girls. In fact, in 1940 and 41, a Polish underground report that was sent to the Polish government in exile in London said that the hostility to the Jews under German occupation was tremendous. In fact, one report states that he hears people talking about how when the war is over, we must build a monument to Adolf Hitler, a statue to Adolf Hitler. Now, this seems, again, contrary. The Poles are under German occupation. The Poles are struggling. The Poles hate the Germans. But why is it being said in street talk, why we have to build a monument to Adolf Hitler? Because Hitler, a bastard though he was, Hitler indeed did something we could never do. He was ridding Poland of the Jews. So there were people who did collaborate with the Germans. I would be lying to you if I denied that. There's no way to whitewash that. But it is also would be wrong if I said to you that all the Poles felt that way. That is not true. There were many Poles. Again, how many we do not know. There were a fairly large number of Poles that worked to support the Jews. Let me give you some names. These are the names that people are interested in the Holocaust that they should be familiar with. One is a major underground Polish organization known as Zegota, Z-E-G-O-T-A. Zegota was an underground organization that was designed specifically to save Jews. These Polish Catholics saved at least 4,000 Jews, providing them with food, with false documents, providing living conditions, apartments, and so on. And please keep in mind, sometimes people forget this, the penalty for sheltering a Jew in German-occupied Poland was death for you, for your family, and the expropriation of your property. Be careful with this. People, when you study the Holocaust, you have to understand this. Hundreds of Poles will be executed by the Germans because they sheltered Jews. Why did the Poles do this type of thing? Why did they help Jews? Well, simple humanitarian impulses, a belief that Christian morality should motivate people to help those who are oppressed. Whatever the reason may be, there were Poles that helped Jews. In Jerusalem at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and the Holocaust Museum, there's a street known as the Street of the Righteous Gentiles. Trees are planted in behalf or to commemorate the role that some Christians played in saving Jews. There are at least 5,000 trees that are planted in honor of Poles who saved Jews. There are more trees planted at Yad Vashem in honor of Polish citizens who helped Jews than there are for any other country occupied by the Germans. So again, I'm trying to say to you, there was Poles that did help Jews at the risk of their lives. The overwhelming majority of Poles, they were not indifferent. They were frightened people. They were people who were struggling, people who were hungry, people who worried about Nazi policies of collective punishment. The overwhelming majority of Poles neither helped the Jews nor hurt the Jews. They simply stood aloof. They stood aside. So what are we to make of all of this? It is a mixed bag, a very, very mixed bag. Some Poles collaborated in the ways that I told you before. Some Poles helped Jews, and again, always at the risk of their lives. And most Poles simply stood aside and watched history unfold. So it was a mixed bag. There should be no rush to judgment here about Poles and the Polish nation in this period of time. Let me remind you again of some of the things that I said in the lecture. Point number one, forgive me for repeating myself, but it is so important. It is necessary to keep this in mind. And that is the penalty for sheltering a Jew was death for you and your family and the expropriation of property. When I discuss this with my students at Union, I say to them, I try to be as honest as I can. If I were a Polish Catholic during this period, and a Polish Jew came to me and said, would you shelter me and my family? I'm not sure I would. I think I know what I would not do. I would not murder a Jew. I would not betray a Jew. I would not rape a Jewish woman or a Jewish girl. That I think I could be sure of, that these are the things I would not do. But would I risk my own life and my family's life in order to shelter Jewish family? I don't know. I just don't know. It would be wise to recognize, to remember the Talmudic adage, don't judge a man until you have stood, or a woman for that matter, until you have stood in their shoes. Be careful here. The historian always wants to put the students of history back in time and place. You can't understand history unless you put yourself back in time and place. And yes, there were Jews that were betrayed. Yes, there were Jews that were killed by Poles. There is no question about that. But I will also tell you this, and I must tell you in my conversations with my Holocaust survivor friends, and I have a number of them, they don't like to hear what I say, but then they grudgingly agree to what I say. Any Jew who lived in German-occupied Poland and survived the Second World War could not have survived unless he or she was somewhere along the line was helped by a sympathetic Pole. So what are we to do? Again, no rush to judgment. Let us condemn those who collaborated. Condemn them. They are the scum of humanity. Let us praise those heroes and heroines who risked everything that they had in order to save Jews. And to use the old language, maybe a little rachmanis, a little sympathy and pity for the largest number of Poles who just sat it out. In the final analysis, my friends, it's the historians who will make the final statement. It's historians maybe 20 to 30, 40 years from now, who have gotten all of the documentation, who have gone into all of the archives, who will have read all of the memoirs, have all of the oral history. They're the ones that will make the final judgment. The verdict, in fact, my friends, on Poland in the period of the Holocaust, the verdict is not yet sealed. Thank you very much for listening. And I must tell you before I turn it over to someone else, I must tell you, as has been said before, I am a very strong supporter of the Holocaust Memorial. Look at the time in which we are living. Anti-Semitism is rising in our country. Anti-Semitism is ubiquitous. In short, we need something. We must always inculcate people, inculcate them with the idea that racism is an abomination. It is a moral abomination from whatever tradition you stand. And the best weapon that we have is education. Education in the schools, education in literature, education in films, and education through the building of a magnificent memorial that will not only commemorate the dead, but will also instruct future generations. Thank you very much.
I am Rabbi Scott Shpeen from Congregation Beth Emeth in Albany, and I've always known that following Steve Berk is no easy task because he's so very articulate and certainly so well versed in the topics about which he speaks. I've known Steve for so many years now and have had the pleasure to work together with him for so many years that no matter how many times I hear him speak, even if it's about the same subject, I still am engrossed by his, certainly his knowledge and his spirit and charisma in sharing the information that he does with all of us. I also had the good fortune on a number of occasions to lead missions to Eastern Europe, where Steve was our scholar in residence. Most recently, the last trip several years ago was particularly meaningful because Bishop Scharfenberger joined us as part of our group. And it was a wonderful experience having him with us, seeing through his eyes all that we experienced in Eastern Europe. And for me personally, in addition to the friendship that we share, to have had the opportunity, which I don't believe often happens with a rabbi and a bishop, to lead a memorial service at Auschwitz when we visited there with our group. And that was a very powerful moment, and certainly within my rabbinate as well, doing it with Bishop Scharfenberger. And Bishop Scharfenberger, who is so attuned and sensitive to our studies and commemorating and memorializing the Holocaust, was so very gracious, as we all know, in providing the land in Niskayuna for the memorial to be constructed. And it's something that we all look forward to having as a lasting tribute and legacy in our Capital District community to honor and memorialize those who perished during the Shoah, but more importantly, to provide a vehicle for further education and understanding and building bridges within the greater community about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, with the resolve, we hope and pray, never again.
I want to thank Professor Berk and our speakers for their participation. And I know that we were all given an incredible experience listening to Professor Berk's lecture. In another moment or so, he will be responding to the questions that you provided. And I would urge you, if you can, to consider donating toward and for the construction and development of the Holocaust Memorial. That would be very much appreciated and very necessary. So thank you all again for listening, and we plan future webinars, and I hope that we will be seeing you more in the future. And thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll start with the first question from Michael. How do we avoid the creeping universalization of American Holocaust memorial institutions, increasingly impacted by the current events and increasingly influenced by a generation which is further removed from the Shoah and all its uniqueness?
First of all, Sonia, let me say, I'm not sure I understand that question, but I will tell, let me say this. I teach at a wonderful institution. It's a beautiful place. Students are nice, faculty are nice, but there's one thing that's wrong if you teach history. Every year I get 1 year older, and these kids, they're always between 17 and 22. Drives me crazy. Things that were important to me, the First World War, for example, the Second World War. I wasn't there for the First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust, the creation of the State of Israel. All of these things were terribly important to me. But if you're 17 years old, 17 to 21 or 17 to 22, they mean nothing. It's history. It's just ancient history. And the further we get away from these things, it has less of an impact on us. That's why we've got to bridge the gap. That's why we've got to somehow teach these youngsters about not only the Holocaust, not about the Second World War, but about events that were so important. I go back to what I said in the beginning of my talk. You cannot explain the present by the present. If you want to understand or try to understand the problems and to solve the problems that we are confronting at the present time, problems like anti-Semitism, for example, anti-Zionism, one has to go back in history and see the roots of this. That's our job, and that's the job what a memorial will do. We have had exhibits concerning the Holocaust at Union College, and school districts came. Lots of school districts, lots of kids. Murray Jaros and I have spoken to students at Niskayuna. I've spoken to some of the students in this and teachers in the Schenectady School District and other school districts. So this is the way, this is the only way in a free society where there's a marketplace of ideas, where you can really fight anti-Semitism and racism. One of the lessons of the Holocaust is that racism, it is racism that paved the ground for Auschwitz. Racism really inculcated into Western civilization for almost 2,000 years. Anti-Semitism, anti-Black sentiment. These ideas are important in history. There are some ideas that are good, some ideas that are bad. And some of the bad ideas, some of the worst of them, are, of course, anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism that led to the gas chambers. So we must combat this in every possible way that we can. And one of those ways is to build an educational Holocaust memorial. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Professor Berk. Nazia would like to ask, how many Holocaust survivors are there?
Oh, that's a hard one to know. There are probably, remember, unfortunately, we all get old. Each year, more and more are dying. There are probably today, it's hard to even give a ballpark figure. There are probably, I would say today, looked up through the entire world, probably about 400,000 Holocaust survivors that are still alive.
Thank you.
That includes a fairly large number in Israel, numbers in Eastern Europe, in Russia and the Ukraine, and in our country, Australia, Argentina, and the UK, and France.
Thank you, Professor Berk. The next question comes from Lev. In the context of Polish treatment of Jews being a mixed bag, can you expand on things like the Kiel massacre of 1946 and the historical revisionism going on today?
Oh, that's a very, the questions are very good. That's the Kielce massacre of July 4th, 1946. Kielce is a fairly small city in Poland, and a rumor spread. A Polish boy was missing. And the rumor spread, and this again, the background for this, the fertile soil for this is that long history of Polish anti-Semitism. The rumor spread that the boy was kidnapped and killed by Jews. And so a pogrom took place. 42 Jewish survivors of Auschwitz were murdered by Poles on July 4th of 1946. After the slaughter of the Jews, the boy was found. His father was an alcoholic and was beating the boy, so the boy ran away to a nearby town to be with another relative. But the damage was done, 42 dead Jews. This testifies again, the anti-Semitism is there. Now, today, there is a revisionist movement alive in Poland, which tries to make the point that all the Poles, or put it another way, there was no Polish culpability for the murder of Jews. The Poles were under the gun themselves. They did everything in their power to save Jews. That, of course, is nonsense. I tried to say that in the talk. Let me give you an example of what happens in Poland, how Poland really struggles with the Holocaust, with the memory of the Holocaust. There's a lot of guilt there. So, for example, Poland was rocked back on its heels by a book that was published. It's been published in English, and it's translated into Polish, by a Polish historian, a Pole who was brought up in Poland and then came to the United States. That's Jan Gross. And the book he wrote was Neighbors. It's the story of a small Polish town called Jedwabne. In Jedwabne, the Jews and Poles lived side by side. When the Germans came in, did the Germans inspire it? Did they force it? The answer, they may have inspired it, but they didn't force the Poles to do it. The Poles murdered the Polish citizens of Jedwabne. Some of the Polish citizens of Jedwabne murdered at least 800 Jews. They burnt them alive, they threw them into a nearby lake, and they just killed them. And that's not the only town that took place. This took place in 1941. So when you put Kelsa onto the scale, it's testimony to the continuing existence of Polish anti-Semitism. The Poles didn't like to hear about the Jedwabne. They don't like to hear that they were culpable, that they were guilty in any way. And anybody who says that, according to the new Polish laws, can find themselves in legal difficulty. The Poles want to present themselves as a suffering nation, as a nation that suffered. The Poles will concede the point. The Jews suffered worse than they did, but they also suffered terribly. And again, their argument is that we did everything that we could. Not altogether true, as I tried to say in the lecture. That's a combination of Polish nationalism, Polish chauvinism, and Polish anti-Semitism. The Poles are very defensive about it, and that's why they are acting today as they have done, as they have done for the last several years. It's an unfortunate development, a very unfortunate development. But again, I must tell you, not everybody in Poland feels that way. There are many, many Poles that really come clean on this stuff, that are honest, and they admit Polish responsibility. It's not you can't make any blanket statements about Poland. This in Poland is a right-wing government. It's a government that draws support from the more reactionary and the most conservative elements in Poland. That's why it wins elections. It's tried to do all sorts of laws on abortion and things like that. It's packed the Supreme Court. It is acted in, let us say, not in a true democratic fashion. The Poles, succinctly put, the Poles are very defensive. They don't want to hear a single word. They think that anybody who talks about Polish collaboration with the Nazis is tarnishing the image of Poland, and the Poles deserve better than that. So they say. Any more questions, Sonia?
Yes, definitely. So this next question comes from Heidi. Are you aware of the work of Alexander Lados and other Polish diplomats in Switzerland who fabricated South American passports for Jews across Europe? They worked in tandem with Jewish leaders.
Yes,
my family was
that is correct.
these passports.
That is correct. As I said, there were Poles, both in the diplomatic corps and of course on the ground in Poland, that worked to help Jews. I thank the questioner for making that point. There were Polish diplomats that did. There were Spanish diplomats and Portuguese diplomats. There was a Japanese diplomat, Sugihara, that saved several thousand Jews. It isn't true that the whole world was against the Jews. Here's an important axiom of the Holocaust. The whole world was not against the Jews. The problem confronting the Jews was a fundamental asymmetry. That is, if Adolf Hitler, spirit of Adolf Hitler, heaven forbid, got into this discussion, and I asked him, Herr Hitler, that's what the British used to call him before the war, Herr Hitler, what were the major war aims of the Third Reich? And Hitler would have given the answer, you can bet your last dollar. Hitler would have said, one of our major aims is to make Europe Judenrein, make Europe clean of Jews. And the Germans sacrificed. They allocated men, they allocated materiel and trains to murder the Jews. The asymmetry is, for many people in the world who really were not anti-Semites, were sympathetic to the Jews, they did not dedicate themselves to the saving of Jews as the Nazis did to the murder of Jews. When there were people who were prepared to do that, like those Polish diplomats, like Raoul Wallenberg, like others, like Sugahara, like a whole group of people, like a number of Catholic priests who did in fact save Jews. There's no question. When they dedicated their lives and really put their lives at risk to save Jews, then Jews were saved. That's the asymmetry. Again, for the Nazis, the murder of Jews took precedence over almost everything else. For those who knew what was happening and wanted to help, they never made helping the Jews top on their priority list.
Thank you, Professor Berk. This next question comes from Ina. Did the Polish resistance have its beginnings during the interwar period inside the Warsaw Ghetto?
Now, if you're talking about the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, really, it comes from the youth organizations that existed in Poland. Hashomer Hatzair, Beitar, Gordonia, Hechalutz. These are the Jewish organizations. They were youth organizations. When the Nazis occupied Poland and put the Jews in ghettos, these members of these youth organizations got together and they began to form resistance organizations. In the case of the Polish resistance, again, that begins after German occupation as well. The Polish resistance had an enormous advantage over the Jews in the sense that they received support from the Polish, or a good segment of the Polish population. Now, in addition to that, Poland has a long history of resistance against oppression. Twice in the 19th century, in 1830 and 1863, the Poles rose in revolt against their Russian occupiers. They were beaten down, but they rose in revolt. When the Nazis occupied Poland and the Polish army surrendered, the order went out from Polish officers to Polish soldiers: bury your weapons, put them in special places, because we're going to need them again when we begin to form resistance against the Germans. The shortage of weapons was a bane, with a tremendous obstacle to Jewish resistance. And this gets us into this whole discussion of the Polish underground's attitude towards the Jews. Some members of the Polish underground were so hostile to the Jews that they spent more time in hunting down Jews who were trying to escape the dragnets and trying to escape the Nazis than they did in fighting the Germans. There's no question about that. It was difficult for Jews to enter into some of the units of the main Polish underground, the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. Some of these units would not take Jews. And sometimes when they found out that there were Jews who were masquerading as Christians, they killed the Jews. But there were Polish underground units that helped the Jews and that allowed Jews to enter into their units. But Jewish resistance organizations had a problem with weapons. And the Polish underground did not turn over adequate supplies of weapons. They had the weapons, they didn't turn large numbers of them over to the Jews. There are a number of reasons for this. Some were sheer anti-Semitism, a belief that the Jews were communists. The Jewish leaders of the youth organizations were communists, or people of the left. And then the Poles had a different agenda. The Jews were under the gun. They were all going to die. The motto in the Warsaw Ghetto was to live with honor and to die with honor. The Poles are not under the same gun. They're suffering terribly, but they're not facing extermination, not yet. What the Poles are hoping for is a Polish revolt as the Red Army pushes the Poles back. That's the origin of the Great Polish Warsaw Revolt in August and September of 1944. The Poles believe mistakenly that the Germans are retreating. They also believe that the Russians, if necessary, will come and bail them out. Stalin holds the Red Army back. The Germans decide to fight for Warsaw. They burn the city to the ground. About 90% of the city is destroyed. 250,000 Poles are killed, and the rest are thrown out of the city. So it is, again, in dealing with, it's a mixed bag there. Some Polish underground units help Jews. Some kill Jews. Some don't allow Jews in. Some allow Jews in. Go ahead, Sonia.
Perfect. This next question comes from Sandy, your friend from the Cuba trip. What can and should be taught to students younger than college students? There are very few appropriate educational materials.
That she's asking what books are there? There's a plethora of books. I mean, there's so many films. I tell you what I've told people in other lectures. I never thought when I started teaching at Union that I would ever tell students to watch television. I never thought I would do this. There is so much good stuff on the war, on the Holocaust, on the relations between Poles and Jews. There is so much good material on television, on Netflix, on Amazon Prime, on a whole host of areas that I tell the students, I even require the students to see some things. So books, television programs, and of course, Holocaust memorials. That's the way we deal with this, and that's the way you can deal with young people. But no guarantees here. No guarantees. We live in a marketplace of ideas. You can't force people to learn. You can bring them to the water, but you can't force them to drink the water. So we do the best that we can here. But there is no shortage of material published by all sorts of institutions, educational institutions, private institutions, no shortage of material in learning about the Holocaust.
Thank you, Professor Berk. This next question is from Marion. As a Polish-American Catholic, I've carried the burden of hearing that Poles were so eager to have their Jewish neighbors removed. What can be done to have everyone hear what I did tonight about the number of trees to commemorate the Poles who are righteous?
I did what I could. Your point is a good one. How many times did I say in the talk and really in the question and answer period, you can make no general statement about the Poles. There were large numbers of Poles, I'm sorry to say, that really did want to rid Poland of Jews. There were. But there were also Poles that rallied to the defense of Jews. You can only lay out the facts. That's what you can do. And you lay out the facts and you let people make their own judgment. But I will tell you, when I hear from people that the Poles are anti-Semites, that the Poles did terrible things, and people say that, and they say that they mean or imply that all the Poles did that, I try to point out as best as I can that that is wrong. Again, your question is a good one. It forces me, forgive me for repeating myself. And that is, again, one should really understand to help a Jew in German-occupied Poland was to risk death. And I said, I told you in the talk, I'm not sure what I would have done if I were a Polish Catholic, which means it's all the more important to honor those people, those men and women. I'll give you their names. You should be familiar with them. Irina Sendler, Władysław Bartoszewski, Henryk Wolinski. These were great men. And in the case of Irina Sendler, great women, a great woman. These are people that risked everything. Everything. And the general German treatment towards the Poles was abominable. The Germans had at least a modicum of respect for the French, the Belgians, the Dutch. They had some respect for them. In the eyes of Nazi theory, the Poles were Untermenschen. They were subhuman types. If you sheltered a Jew in France, they'd send you to a concentration camp. I mean, I'm not making light of that. They might send you to Dachau, to Buchenwald, or to other camps, maybe even to Auschwitz. But they didn't kill you on the spot. That's what was done in Poland. So you are right. And I did say in the talk, remember, there's thousands of trees that are planted in behalf of Poles that saved Jews during the war.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tanya.
So Maz asks, I learned from the film The Courageous Heart of Irina Sendler that many of the Jews in Poland only spoke Yiddish. I also understand that Orthodox Jews have religious restrictions which prohibit certain or all interactions with Gentiles. Could you comment?
All right. It is a myth that all Polish Jews spoke Yiddish. In fact, had the war not come, most Polish Jews would eventually have used Polish as their language. Even before the war, large numbers of Jews did in fact claim Polish as their mother tongue and the language that they used all the time. So again, Jews in Poland were becoming Polonized. Polish was their language. Most still were familiar with Yiddish. And some people, some Jews in Poland only spoke Yiddish. But a growing number did in fact speak Polish. And again, had the war not come, because of the educational system with Jewish parents sending their children to Polish schools, the fact is the Jewish community would have been Polonized. Now, as far as Orthodox Jews not having contact with Gentiles, that's simply not true. It's just not true. You couldn't live in Poland and be Jewish and not have contact with Gentiles. You operated with them. The Jews were a minority, a large minority. 10% of Poland, maybe 12% of Poland was Jewish. But that's only 12% at the maximum. You had to interact with Gentiles in business, on the street, in a whole variety of ways. So it is not true that Jews had no contact with Gentiles or that Orthodox Jews prevented members of their community to having contact with Gentiles. Simply not true.
Thank you, Professor. Sandy asks, please talk about the role of Father Kuglin in Anti-S.
I'm sorry, Sonia, I didn't hear that question.
No problem. Sandy asks, please talk about the role of Father Kuglin in Anti-S.
You know, I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe the pronunciation of the name is not right.
We can just move on to the next question from
Yeah, move on to, I'm not sure I understand that question.
No problem at all. Nazia asks, did the Holocaust affect their belief in God?
Of course it did. For some people, it did. This is an ancient problem. It's not peculiar to our time. It's not peculiar to the Jewish people. It's Rabbi Kushner who raised the question. Again, it's an old question. This is what is known as theodicy. That is, if God is good and God is omniscient and God is omnipotent, then why does he allow bad things to happen? Rabbi Kushner wrote the book, sold in the tens of millions, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's an ancient problem for Christians, for Jews, for Muslims, and for all believing people. If you're an atheist, it's not an issue. If you are a believer in a good God, an omniscient God, what can I say to you? This is a question that is best answered by a priest, an imam, and a rabbi. I can give you what the usual answer is. Rabbi Kushner gave a different answer. He said that God was not omnipotent, that God cannot control humanity. God cannot do certain things. He cannot intervene. But what God has given us is the spirit, the strength, the friendships that we have that enable us to carry on. The traditional view is expressed in the book of Job. I'm not a theologian. I'm not poaching. I don't want to poach on anybody's territory. And that is Job, who has suffered so much, and finally has this interview with God and says, God, Job has a lot of chutzpah. He says to God, why did you do this to me? Why did you do this? And the answer that is given in the book of Job, many people find it unsatisfactory. God says to Job, Job, did you make the moon? Did you make the stars? Did you create the universe? And of course, Job says no. And then God says, then how can you question me? Again, there are other answers that are given. That is, of course, this was done not by God. This was done by human beings. And the tradition is, at least in Judaism, that we have free will, that human beings have free will. Don't blame God for the terrible actions of other people. Again, it is your question, again, like the other questions, they're very good. It's just difficult to answer these questions. And I must tell you, everybody talks about the conflict between science and religion. I don't believe there is much of a conflict there. You can finesse the religion in such a way. You can make it for the most part, be consistent with science. The real problem with religion is, the real threat to religion is life. Look what people experience. A breast cancer there, a brain tumor there, a heart attack there, a terrible accident. That's life. How do you reconcile this with an omniscient, omnipotent, and good God? That's really the issue. And I speak to you as someone who is a believer. It's no coincidence that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the so-called God is dead movement appeared. No coincidence that in Europe, you don't find many people going to church. Remember, we are a blessed country in the sense that we haven't been occupied since the War of 1812. No bombs have rained down on our cities. No concentration camps here. No mass murders here. Terrible incidents for sure, but no massive murders. But for people under the gun, for people who experienced the horrors of the Second World War, the issue of a belief in God is a very, very problematic one. Go ahead, Sonia.
Okay, Professor Berk, we just have a couple of questions left. Rachel says, I'm a former student of Professor Berk, Union graduating class of 96, and legacy of several members who also had the privilege of having Professor Berk as a teacher. As always, your lectures are tremendously thought-provoking and educational. I'm so happy to be able to have attended your presentation this evening. Do you believe that the current increase in anti-Semitism is a new increase? Or is this current rise of anti-Semitism the result of perceived permission to engage in such behavior over the last several years and a coming out of the closet or the underground?
Oh, Rachel, first of all, thank you for your kind words. Stay in contact, Rachel, one way or another. That's, again, a very good question, a difficult question to answer. I know what the conventional answer is. Blame it all on President Trump because of his words after the Charlottesville incident and so on. I don't think it's that easy to say that. Certainly, President Trump did not help the cause. But what people forget, in his inaugural, his State of the Union message in the year 2019, he gave an unequivocal condemnation of anti-Semitism. No American public figure has ever spoken as emphatically about anti-Semitism and condemning anti-Semitism as did President Trump in the 2019 State of the Union address. And I speak to you as a registered Democrat, as someone who voted for Joe Biden. Now, where does it come from? Many Americans have been bypassed in the economy. Many Americans, again, don't misconstrue what I'm saying. The election of a Black man as president, President Obama, I think just infuriated the white supremacists. They went off the wall on this. Yeah, President Trump should have said some other things, should have omitted saying some other things, but the emergence of a Black president, I'm not blaming President Obama, don't misconstrue this. I voted for him. But the mere fact that we had a Black president just drove some Americans absolutely wild. That's where it was always there, and this is what got them out. And then, of course, again, economic conditions, the fact that Israel, some people see Israel as an evil force. I don't believe that for a second, but some people do. Remember, as I tell my students, if you forget everything that I ever said to you, remember this: perception is reality. It's not important what is real. It is what is important is what people think are real. These are the important things. So I do see a rise in anti-Semitism. It is there. The white supremacists are the ones most likely to resort to physical violence against Jews. Their world is changing. We are a nation that is increasingly diverse. People of color, people of different origins are moving into positions of authority. And there are some people who are bypassed who resent that a great deal.
Thank you, Professor. So the last question of the evening. What is your opinion of the recent defamation case against Jan Grabowski and another historian in Poland, where they were found guilty of defamation and have to apologize? Will this create a chilling effect on historians of Polish history?
It sure will. That's what I made reference to. I didn't give you the proper nouns there. These are Polish historians who are telling the truth. And the truth is there was a certain amount of collaboration with the Nazis by Poles. They are saying what I said to you in the lecture. They are saying that some Poles murdered Jews, some Poles betrayed Jews, some Poles raped Jewish women and girls. And given the current climate in Poland, these people are in real trouble. Jan Gross, for example, the man who wrote Neighbors, he had written one of his earlier books, was a very good study of the Polish underground. He was invited back to Poland, given a whole series of medals because of this, an honored Pole in emigration. After he wrote Neighbors, they stripped him of all the medals. They condemned him. There's a film that some of you might want to see. It's a tough film to take. The film is called Ida, about a young Polish girl, a young Polish woman. I think she's a teenager, maybe an early teen, but I think actually a teenager. She is studying to be a nun. And the Mother Superior tells her that she's really Jewish. Now, that's the only Polish film that I've ever seen. And I've seen a number of Polish films because I spent a good deal of time in Poland. It's the only Polish film that I've ever seen that really shows Poles being responsible for the death of Jews. The director of that film was forced to leave Poland for a time. He was threatened. So the answer to your question with Grabowski and the others, yes, it is going to have a chilling effect on Polish historiography. Fortunately, it doesn't affect, not in a direct sense, those Polish historians or those historians of Poland that are living outside of Poland. So it is, but the direct answer to your question is, it does have a chilling effect.
Okay, Professor Berk, I actually just have one last question for you. What can you say about Herman Schaper trial in 1960 to 1965?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that trial. Reed, can you give me the name again?
Herman Schaper or Herman Schaper?
You know, I'm sorry, I am not familiar with that. If the questioner is there, could he or she begin to elaborate upon that question?
They can add another question in the chat to further explain.
Go ahead, yes, they can, please do.
Great. The other question, actually, I mispronounced Father Coughlin.
Oh, that's Father Coughlin. Ah, that's a different issue. Father Coughlin was a priest in Detroit who was the first radio priest. He spoke, I believe, at 7 o'clock every Sunday, and he was an anti-Semite. He talked about the Jew deal instead of the New Deal, held the Jews responsible for capitalism, for communism, for the Depression, and a whole sort of things. And he was an influential man. I think 10 million people listened to him every Sunday night. That was an unfortunate thing. But Cardinal Mundelein in Chicago bridled him, forced him to stop saying it. But for the years that he was on the radio, he was one of the 3 leading anti-Semites in American society. The only time when anti-Semitism reached really significant proportions in our country was in the interwar period. And that was a consequence of the 3 men. One was Charles Lindbergh, the other was Henry Ford, and the other was Father Coughlin. And these men spewed anti-Semitism. If you bought a Ford in the 1920s and you drove the car off of the lot and you opened up the dashboard, you would have a complimentary copy of Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent. That was a weekly newspaper, in which was published an American version of the most important anti-Semitic document, the most effective anti-Semitic document in the modern period. That is the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion. This was a document, a forgery, that was produced by the Russian secret police before World War I. And it attempted to say, or it said, that there was an underground Jewish government all over the world that was trying to subjugate Christians all over the world to Jewish control. It was a lie, it was a fabrication. But Ford and the Dearborn Independent on a weekly basis published a series called The International Jew, which in fact really said almost the same thing that the protocols had said. So Charles Lindbergh, America's greatest hero up until the Second World War, the man who flew all across the Atlantic to Paris, he hated Jews, hated them. And he said, but he used nuanced language. So for example, when he gave a speech in Des Moines in Iowa on July 4th of 1941, he didn't speak about Jews. He said there's a group of people in our country that are more interested in their co-religionists in Germany than they are really in the rest of, than they are in the fate of the United States. Lindbergh, Father Coughlin, and Henry Ford. These are the men that are really virulently anti-Semitic in this period of time. Anything else? Did that person want to elaborate?
We received a couple of other questions.
I'm ready. I'll stay here as long as they are.
Great. Do you know the current state of Holocaust Memorial building in Poland? Specifically, in memorials lost to the Jewish community in general, or cemetery preservation?
There have been attacks on Jewish cemeteries, but I must tell you, I went to Poland for the first time in 1985, and someone gave me a book. It was a book upon restoration of Jewish cemeteries that had been desecrated during the war and after the war. The provenance of that book is really a very interesting one. The book was done by a Polish Catholic couple. They thought it was terrible that Jewish cemeteries were being desecrated, and they did whatever they could to rebuild them. And what they did is they took photographs of the cemeteries, and they wanted to show them in universities or in libraries and so on. The Polish government would not allow them to do that. And you know where those photographs were shown? In Polish Catholic churches. Again, I've said some harsh things about the church in its attitude towards Jews, but there was also a good deal of philo-Semitism in the Roman Catholic Church. There were good Catholics who believed that desecration of Jewish cemeteries was wrong, the murder of Jews was wrong, and it is necessary to set the record straight. And I must tell you parenthetically, probably no one has done more to rehabilitate Jewish cemeteries than Dr. Lozman. Dr. Lozman has taken Union College students from other colleges, and has taken them to Poland, to Lithuania, to Belarus, has taken them, and they has rebuilt cemeteries. Dr. Lozman is a very impressive man. Not only is he really the impetus for this Holocaust memorial, but he is also a man that is probably more than any other American has tried to rehabilitate some of those Jewish cemeteries. But in Poland, again, there's a movement by secular people, religious Catholics, as well as the small Jewish community to rebuild some of those cemeteries. As far as Holocaust memorials are concerned, you know, there are some, and they have not been touched. They have not been desecrated. And there is now, when this damn pandemic is over and people are traveling again, a trip to Warsaw is worthwhile for a whole variety of reasons. Believe it or not, it is a pretty city. There are things to see there. If you're interested in the Second World War, interested in the Holocaust, there are things to see there. And one of the things to see is what is a magnificent museum called Poland. That's a museum of Polish Jewish history, and it deals with the Holocaust. And the Polish mayor of Warsaw allocated money to build the museum. Some Poles that allocated money, and of course, Jews allocated money for the building of this museum. So there's no desecration, to the best of my knowledge, of Holocaust memorials. And I would also say to you, when you get to Warsaw, go to the zoo. It's a good zoo. If you like to go to zoos, you go to the zoo. But in the zoo is a Holocaust memorial. Because the husband and wife that ran the zoo, the Zabinskis, saved several hundred Jews during the war. They hid them in the basement of the main building of the zoo. Again, testimony to those righteous Gentiles. That's, of course, it is depicted in the zookeeper's wife. Go ahead. Go ahead, Sonia.
Okay, Professor Berk, that's actually a great place to end.
All right. Thank you all very much for tuning in. For those of you who observe Passover, Chag Pesach Sameach. Have a very, very good and healthy Passover. Thank you for clicking in. I hope that you have been interested in, I wouldn't say enjoy the talk, but we're interested in the talk. Any of you want to contact me talking about it, I would be delighted to speak with you. And as I tell my students and I tell my children and grandchildren, read, read, and read. There is no substitute for reading and for really, in order to get into the material, in order to learn more. Thank you very much. Chag Pesach Sameach. Bye-bye.